a dented aluminum pot on a gas stove in a Memphis kitchen, 1971. It belonged to a woman named Erline Mays. She was 73, lived alone, and cooked every meal in that one pot for 11 years straight. Her Social Security check was $94 a month. She stretched it across 30 days without missing a single meal. Number 7 cost her less than 40 cents. Number 14 came from a recipe her grandmother carried out of the Delta. Number 21 was invented by a church mother who could not afford 2 burners. These 25 soul food one-pot meals kept Black seniors alive when the world forgot about them. They fed people eating alone at tables that used to seat 8. Hit that subscribe button. Let us count them down. Number 25, tomato and okra pilau. This was a low-country meal that traveled from the rice fields of South Carolina into every kitchen where a Black woman knew how to stretch $1. A can of tomatoes, a handful of okra, a cup of rice, a spoonful of bacon grease, salt, and water. 30 minutes later, you had a thick, savory pot that tasted like someone had been cooking all day. The bacon grease gave it a depth that had no right being in a meal that cost so little. In the 1960s, a retired domestic worker in Beaufort, South Carolina, named Viola Simmons, made this 3 nights a week on $6 a week for groceries. The whole pot cost less than 50 cents and fed her for 2 days. She told her pastor it was the only meal that made her kitchen smell the way her mother's house used to smell back when the family was still together. She wasn't trying to be a chef. She was trying to feel less alone. That was enough. Number 24, tripe and hominy stew. Most people today wouldn't touch tripe, but for Black seniors who grew up in the rural South, tripe was a gift. A pound of honeycomb tripe cost 29 cents in 1972. A can of hominy cost a dime. You cleaned the tripe, cut it into strips, and simmered it with the hominy, onions, garlic, a bay leaf, and water. 4 hours turned the tripe tender and rich. The hominy swelled into a stew that stuck to your bones and didn't ask for anything else beside it. A retired hog farmer outside Macon, Georgia, ate this every Saturday for 9 years after his wife passed. He made it the way she taught him. He said the smell of it simmering was the closest thing he had to her being in the room. Nobody wrote it in a cookbook. It kept a man fed and whole when the house felt too empty to bear. Number 23, Brunswick stew. This was the meal that fed entire churches on a Sunday afternoon. The original came out of Virginia in the 1820s, and by the time it reached Black communities across the Deep South, it had become something different, something better. A senior would take whatever meat was on sale, usually chicken thighs at 39 cents a pound, and drop them in a pot with canned tomatoes, corn, lima beans, potatoes, and a splash of vinegar. 2 hours of simmering and the chicken fell apart into a thick, smoky broth. One batch made enough for 4 days. A woman named Lucille Harper in Savannah, Georgia, made Brunswick stew every other week for 14 years after her husband died in 1969. She never measured a thing. She said your hands know what a pot needs if you've been cooking long enough. The truth is, it belonged to whoever needed a cheap meal that tasted like someone loved them. Number 22, butter bean succotash pot. Butter beans were the quiet backbone of Black Southern cooking. They were cheap. They kept for months dried, and they turned creamy when you cooked them low and slow. A senior would soak a cup of dry butter beans overnight, then simmer them the next day with corn cut off the cob, a piece of salt pork, onions, and a little water. 2 hours later, the beans had broken down into a thick, starchy stew that did not need a single other dish beside it. In the 1950s, a bag of dry butter beans cost 15 cents, and fed a person for a week. The salt pork was often left over from another meal already paid for. A retired seamstress in Natchez, Mississippi, ate butterbean succotash 4 nights a week for 7 years. She grew the beans herself in a garden behind her house until her knees gave out in 1978. After that, she bought them dried from the corner store and never complained about the difference. The meal didn't change. Her body did. The pot didn't care. Number 21, smothered chicken and gravy. This was the meal a church mother invented because she had one pot, one burner, and not enough strength to stand at the stove for an hour. Leg quarters at 29 cents a pound, seasoned with salt, pepper, and garlic powder. Browned in bacon grease, then flour stirred into the drippings to make a roux. Water went in and the whole thing simmered, covered for 45 minutes until the chicken fell off the bone and the gravy turned thick enough to pour over rice. A widow named Dorothy Sims in Birmingham, Alabama, made this every Sunday for 11 years after 1974. She stretched a $2 package of leg quarters across 3 meals. She said it wasn't about the chicken. It was about sitting at the table on a Sunday and eating something warm she made with her own hands. That mattered. Number 20, catfish head muddle. In the Carolinas, they called it muddle. In Mississippi, they just called it stew. Either way, it started with the part of the fish most people threw away, the head. A catfish head, an onion, 2 potatoes, and enough water to cover everything. You simmered it for an hour until the potatoes fell apart and the broth pulled every bit of flavor from that head. A pinch of red pepper flakes, a splash of vinegar. That was it. Black fishermen along the Cape Fear River in North Carolina made this for generations. A retired mill worker named James Colvin in Lumberton ate catfish head muddle 3 times a week for 5 years after his wife died in 1973. He caught the fish himself from the Lumber River with a cane pole and a coffee can full of worms. The heads were free. The potatoes cost pennies. His entire weekly grocery bill was $4. Restaurants in Charleston now serve catfish stew for $22 a bowl and call it low country cuisine. James Colvin called it Thursday. Number 19, pinto beans and ham. A bag of dried pinto beans, a ham hock, an onion, water, salt. That was it. You soaked the beans overnight, dropped everything in a pot the next morning, and let it simmer for 3 or 4 hours until the beans turned creamy and the ham fell apart into shreds. The broth was smoky and thick enough to eat with a spoon. A 1-pound bag cost 49 cents in 1975 and made enough food for 5 days. The ham hock was left over from Sunday dinner already paid for. A woman in Tupelo, Mississippi, named Hattie Banks, made pinto beans every Monday for 22 years. She said Monday, beans gave the week a rhythm. She said a week without beans was a week without a backbone. The ritual of cooking, the smell filling a quiet house, the act of sitting down and eating something you made yourself. That was not poverty, that was living. Number 18, neck bone and cabbage pot. Neck bones were the cheapest cut at the butcher counter. In 1970, a pound of pork neck bones cost 19 cents. A head of cabbage cost a dime. Together, they made a meal that could feed a person for 3 days and tasted like someone had been cooking since sunrise. You browned the neck bones in a pot with a little oil, added onions and garlic, then packed the cabbage in on top and poured in enough water to cover half of it. 2 hours of simmering turned the cabbage silky sweet and the neck bones tender enough to fall off the bone. The broth was rich and smoky without a single expensive ingredient. A retired janitor named Willie James Turner in Jackson, Mississippi, made neck bone and cabbage every Wednesday for 12 years. His wife had done all the cooking for 40 years. When she passed in 1968, He didn't know how to boil water. A neighbor named Mrs. Odessa Perry taught him 3 recipes. This was the first one. He said it was the meal that kept him from giving up. Not because it tasted good, which it did, but because making it meant he had a reason to get out of bed on a Wednesday morning. He wasn't cooking for nutrition. He was cooking to prove he was still here. And that is something no meal delivery service and no frozen dinner could ever replace. The act of standing at a stove and feeding yourself is an act of independence. For a generation of Black men who had never cooked a meal in their lives, learning to make neck bone and cabbage wasn't about food. It was about refusing to disappear. Number 17, ham bone and navy bean soup. Nothing went to waste in a household that understood hunger. When the ham was eaten down to the bone itself became the next 3 meals. A senior would drop that bone into a pot with a bag of dried navy beans soaked overnight, an onion, a couple of carrots, and enough water to cover everything by 2 inches. 3 hours of simmering and the beans turned creamy and the broth pulled every last bit of smoky flavor from that bone. A 1-pound bag of navy beans cost 59 cents in 1978 and fed a person for nearly a week. The ham bone was free, already paid for with Sunday dinner. This was arithmetic. This was survival, taught by mothers who never had the luxury of wasting a single thing. A retired Pullman porter in Chicago made this every winter from 1971 to 1983. He had moved north during the Great Migration and brought his mother's recipe from Alabama. Number 16, chicken bog. In the low country of South Carolina, they called it bog because the rice was so wet and thick it looked like a swamp. A whole chicken or a few thighs, rice, onions, salt, pepper, and water. You boiled the chicken until it was tender, pulled the meat off the bones, put the bones back in the broth, and cooked the rice right in that same liquid. The rice absorbed every drop of chicken flavor and turned into a sticky, savory mass that was more comfort than cuisine. A retired tobacco worker in Hemingway, South Carolina, made chicken bog every Friday for 8 years on a budget of $3 a week for groceries. She used leg quarters because they were the cheapest cut. The entire pot cost her 60 cents. She ate it alone at a table that used to seat her husband and 4 children. The table was smaller now, but the meal was the same. Number 15, smothered okra and tomatoes. This was a summer meal in the South when okra was growing in every backyard garden and tomatoes were ripening on the vine faster than anyone could eat them. A senior would slice the okra, dice the tomatoes, and cook them down in a pot with onions, garlic, a little bacon grease, salt, and pepper. 45 minutes of slow cooking turned the okra silky and the tomatoes into a thick sauce. You ate it over rice, and it filled you up for less than a quarter. A woman named Mattie Lou Johnson in Greenwood, Mississippi, grew her own okra and tomatoes until she was 81. She canned what she couldn't eat fresh and made smothered okra all winter long from her own mason jars. When her garden got too much for her in 1979, her neighbor's grandson brought her okra every week and never asked for a penny. He said she had fed him when he was a boy. Number 14, sweet potato and peanut stew. This meal came straight from West Africa and survived the Middle Passage and 200 years of American history to end up in a pot on a stove in the Mississippi Delta. A senior would peel and cube sweet potatoes, drop them in a pot with a spoonful of peanut butter, onions, a can of tomatoes, and enough water to make a broth. An hour of simmering turned it into a thick, creamy stew that was sweet and savory at the same time. A retired cotton picker named Bessie Ruth Williams in Indianola, Mississippi, made this every Thursday from from a recipe her grandmother taught her. Her grandmother had learned it from her own grandmother, who had been born enslaved. The recipe never changed. 4 generations of women made the same stew in the same kind of pot. A jar of peanut butter cost 45 cents in 1965. Sweet potatoes grew in the yard. Nobody called it African food. They just called it supper. Number 13, chitlin stew. Most people under 50 have never seen a chitlin, let alone cooked one. But for black seniors who grew up in the rural South, chitlins weren't a novelty. They were a necessity. Chitterlings, the small intestines of the hog, required hours of cleaning and careful preparation. But once they were clean, a senior could simmer them in a pot with onions, garlic, vinegar, red pepper flakes, and potatoes for 3 to 4 hours until they turned tender and the broth became something rich and complex. The vinegar cut the heaviness. The potatoes thickened it into a proper stew. In the 1950s and 1960s, chitlins were nearly free. Butchers gave them away or sold them for pennies because white customers wouldn't touch them. Black families took what others discarded and turned it into a tradition. A retired sharecropper's wife in Selma, Alabama, made chitlin stew every other Saturday from November through February. She said you could tell how old a woman was by how fast she cleaned a bucket of chitlins. This wasn't a meal people chose for flavor alone. They chose it because it connected them to every winter their mothers and grandmothers had survived. The cleaning was the ritual. The cooking was the ceremony. The eating was the proof that another season had been endured. For seniors living alone, that proof mattered more than any restaurant meal ever could. It said you still had the patience, the knowledge, and the will to do something difficult, and you did it for yourself. Time equals 1 second / greater than number 12, cornmeal mush pot. This was the meal at the very bottom of the ladder. When there was nothing else in the cupboard, there was cornmeal. A cup of cornmeal, 3 cups of water, a pinch of salt. You stirred it over heat until it thickened into a porridge, and that was supper. If you had bacon grease, you stirred in a spoonful. If you had a little sugar, you sprinkled it on top. If you had nothing, you ate it plain. A 5-pound bag of cornmeal cost 39 cents in 1958 and lasted a single person 3 weeks. A retired school teacher in Tuskegee told her students in 1974 that cornmeal mush saved her family during the winter of 1934. 7 people, 1 bag of cornmeal, 6 weeks. She said they ate it morning and night and never complained because complaining meant you did not understand how close you were to eating nothing at all. Cornmeal mush didn't taste like love. It tasted like another day. Number 11, turnip green stew with salt pork. Turnip. Greens were the greens you ate when you couldn't afford collards. They grew faster, they grew wilder, and in many parts of the rural South, they grew for free along the edges of fields and ditches. A senior would wash a mess of turnip greens, chop them rough, and put them in a pot with a piece of salt pork, an onion, a splash of vinegar, and enough water to cover the greens by an inch. 2 hours of simmering turned them tender, and the broth, what people call potlikker, was so rich in nutrients that doctors in the 1940s told patients to drink it like medicine. A retired midwife in rural Georgia picked turnip greens from the roadside every week until she was 79. She said the greens along Highway 41 were sweeter than anything in a store. A piece of salt pork cost 20 cents. The greens cost nothing. That potlikker alone could sustain a person on a day when eating a full meal felt like too much effort. That is what made these meals so important for seniors living alone. Sometimes you didn't have the energy to cook and eat and clean up, but you could drink a cup of potlikker and get through the afternoon. Number 10, red beans and rice. In New Orleans, every Monday was Red Beans Day. It started because Monday was laundry day, and a pot of red beans could simmer all afternoon without anyone watching it. a pound of dried red beans, a ham bone or a few slices of smoked sausage, an onion, a bell pepper, celery, garlic, and rice. The beans went in the pot in the morning. By evening, they had turned into a thick, creamy stew that you ladled over rice. A retired hotel maid in the Trim neighborhood of New Orleans made red beans and rice every Monday from 1962 to 1989. 27 years. Same pot, same recipe, same chair at the same kitchen table. She said the beans simmering was the sound of a proper Monday. She said a house without beans on the stove on a Monday was a house that had lost its way. A pound of dried red beans cost 35 cents. Smoked sausage cost 50 cents for a link. The whole meal came to under $1 and fed her for 3 days. Number 9, oxtail stew. Oxtails were the scraps. Butchers sold them for almost nothing because most customers didn't know what to do with them. In 1968, a pound of oxtails cost 25 cents. A senior would brown them in a pot, add onions, carrots, potatoes, garlic, a bay leaf, and enough water to cover everything. Then the pot went on the lowest flame and stayed there for 4 hours. The meat fell off the bone and the marrow dissolved into a broth so rich it coated the back of a spoon like velvet. A retired hospital orderly in Atlanta named Clarence Simmons made oxtail stew every other Sunday from 1970 until 1985. He bought the oxtails at a butcher on Auburn Avenue who saved the tails for him every week because nobody else wanted them. Today, those same oxtails cost $9 a pound. What was once the cheapest cut in the store is now priced like a luxury. Time equals 1 second / greater than number 8, lima bean and ham hock pot. Lima beans were the workhorse of the Southern pantry. They were bland on their own, which is exactly why they worked. They absorbed whatever flavor you gave them. A ham hock, a pot of dried red pepper, an onion, and a pot of water turned a bag of dried lima beans into a smoky, spicy, filling meal that cost almost nothing and lasted for days. You soaked the beans overnight, dropped them in the pot with the ham hock in the morning, and walked away for 3 hours. By the time you came back, the kitchen smelled like a holiday. A retired laundress in Montgomery, Alabama, made lima beans and ham hock every week from 1966 to 1981. A 1-pound bag of dried lima beans cost 45 cents. A ham hock cost 30 cents. For 75 cents, she had food for 4 days. She never called it cooking. She called it surviving. Number 7, soul food chicken and dumplings. This was the one-pot meal that said everything is going to be all right, even when it was not. A whole chicken boiled until the meat slid off the bones. The bones went back in the broth. Strips of dough made from nothing but flour, water, and a pinch of salt dropped into that broth and cooked until they puffed up and turned soft. The broth was golden and thick with starch from the dumplings. A retired school teacher in Pine Bluff, Arkansas, made chicken and dumplings every Wednesday for 9 years after she lost her husband in 1971. She said it was the only meal that made her feel like she was cooking for someone, even though she ate alone. A whole bird cost 59 cents a pound. The dumplings cost nothing. Flour and water, that was all. But the act of rolling out those dumplings, cutting them into strips, dropping them one by one into a bubbling pot, that was not cooking. That was a woman keeping herself company. Number 6, smothered cabbage with smoked turkey neck. When pork got too expensive or the doctor said to cut back, smoked turkey necks stepped in. They cost 39 cents a pound in 1974 and gave a pot of cabbage the same smoky depth that ham hocks provided. A senior would brown the turkey necks, add a quartered head of cabbage, onions, garlic, a little vinegar, and water. An hour and a half of simmering turned the cabbage sweet and the turkey necks tender. A retired nurse's aide in Houston, Texas, made smothered cabbage with turkey necks every Tuesday for 10 years. She had moved to Houston from Lake Charles, Louisiana in 1958 and brought the recipe with her. A head of cabbage cost 15 cents. 2 smoked turkey necks cost under $1. The whole pot fed her for 3 days and cost less than most people spend on a cup of coffee today. Number 5, Hoppin' John. This meal was older than the country itself. Black-eyed peas and rice cooked in one pot with a piece of salt pork or a ham hock. The peas came from West Africa. The rice came from the low country plantations of South Carolina, where enslaved people grew it, harvested it, and rarely got to eat the good grains. They got the broken rice, the cracked pieces that couldn't be sold. They mixed those broken grains with black-eyed peas and scraps of pork and created a dish that fed millions for generations. A senior living alone in the 1970s could make Hoppin' John for less than 40 cents. A bag of dried black-eyed peas cost $0.25. Rice cost $0.10. You soaked the peas overnight, cooked them with the pork and onion in a pot, and stirred in the rice at the end. A retired dock worker in Charleston made this every New Year's Day for good luck. But he also made it every other Tuesday because luck had nothing to do with why he needed a cheap meal. Hunger did. Number 4, catfish stew. Catfish was the fish of the Black South. It swam in every river, every creek, every pond where a man could drop a line with a worm and a prayer. A senior who could still get to the water could eat for free. You filleted the catfish, cut it into chunks, and dropped it in a pot with potatoes, onions, a can of tomatoes, a little hot sauce, salt, and pepper. 20 minutes of simmering, and the fish flaked apart into the broth, and the potatoes thickened it into a proper stew. A retired tire plant worker in Akron, Ohio, drove back to his hometown of Greenville, Mississippi every summer to fish. He caught enough catfish to fill a cooler and drove it back north. He made catfish stew once a week all winter long. His neighbors could smell it in the hallway and would knock on his door asking for a bowl. He never said no. He said a man who eats alone when he doesn't have to is a man who has forgotten what food is for. A pound of catfish from the river cost nothing but time. A pound from the store cost 89 cents in 1976. Either way, the stew was a full meal. Number 3, neck bone and rice. Neck bones were what the butcher had left after he sold everything else. Pork neck bones, bony and full of cartilage, with just enough meat clinging to the joints to make a meal if you cooked them long enough. A senior would season them with salt, pepper, garlic powder, and onion powder, brown them in a pot, then add water and let them simmer for 2 hours. The meat fell off the bone. The cartilage dissolved into the broth and gave it a body that felt like gravy. You cooked rice separately or stirred it right into the pot at the end. A plate of neck bones and rice cost less than 30 cents to make in 1970. A retired sanitation worker in Detroit made this every Saturday from 1972 to 1986. He had moved north from Meridian, Mississippi during the Great Migration and brought nothing with him except a suitcase and his mother's recipe for neck bones. He said Saturday neck bones were the only thing that still felt like Mississippi in a city that felt like nowhere. Number 2, black-eyed pea stew. Black-eyed peas were the foundation of survival cooking in the Black South. They grew in poor soil. They fixed nitrogen back into the ground, which meant they made the dirt better for next year's crop. They dried on the vine and stored for months without refrigeration. A senior could keep a bag of dried black-eyed peas in the pantry for a year and cook them whenever the money ran out. The recipe was bare: a cup of dried peas soaked overnight, an onion, a clove of garlic, a a piece of smoked meat, any kind, water and salt. You put it all in a pot and walked away for 2 hours. The peas broke down into a thick, earthy stew heavy with protein. A bowl of it with a piece of cornbread was a complete meal that cost less than 20 cents. A retired farm worker in Tuskegee, Alabama, grew her own black-eyed peas until she was 84. She said black-eyed peas were the only crop that never disappointed her. They grew when nothing else would. They fed her when nothing else could. Number 1, potlikker and cornbread. This was the simplest meal on the list and the important. Potlikker was the broth left behind after cooking a pot of greens, collards, turnip greens, mustard greens, any of them. That broth was loaded with vitamins, minerals, and the smoky flavor of whatever pork had been simmered with the greens. Doctors in the 1930s and 1940s told black patients in the rural South to drink potlikker as a tonic. They were right. A cup of potlikker had more iron than most of the expensive supplements sold in drugstores decades later. A senior who had already cooked a pot of greens earlier in the week could reheat that broth, crumble a piece of leftover cornbread into it, and have a meal in 5 minutes. No cooking, no standing, no dishes except a bowl and a spoon. A retired cotton gin worker in Clarksdale, Mississippi, ate potlikker and cornbread 5 nights a week from 1969 to 1982. He said it wasn't a meal. He said it was medicine. He was 78 years old and walked 2 miles to church every Sunday without a cane. His doctor said his iron levels were higher than men half his age. The potlikker was the reason. This was a meal made from what was left behind. The greens were gone. The meat was eaten. But the broth held everything that mattered. It held the vitamins, the flavor, the memory of the meal before it. And a piece of cornbread turned it into something whole. That is what soul food was. It was never about the best cuts or the finest ingredients. It was about taking what the world left you and making it into something that kept you alive, kept you nourished, and kept you sitting at your own table in your own kitchen, eating with your own hands. That was dignity. That was survival. That was enough.
Cowpeas and rice pilaf offered a taste of Carolina heritage that African-American families carried forward with pride during the 1970s. Dried cowpeas soaked overnight were simmered gently with smoked turkey wings or a ham hock until tender, releasing a broth rich with earthy flavor. Long-grain rice was added to the pot, soaking up the seasoned liquid and transforming the dish into a complete meal. Onions, celery, and a hint of thyme gave the pilaf a savory depth, while a dash of hot pepper added subtle heat. Served with cornbread or fried green tomatoes, it filled bellies and satisfied the craving for something both nourishing and steeped in tradition. This was a dinner that honored the resilience of generations who turned humble ingredients into lasting comfort. It carried the memory of fields and family gardens while fitting neatly into busy urban kitchens. Cowpeas and rice pilaf reminded everyone that simple foods, cooked with patience and love, could rival any fancy restaurant meal when shared around a welcoming table. Cabbage and salt pork stew was the kind of meal that could stretch to feed a crowd without stretching the budget. The cabbage would be chopped and simmered slowly with chunks of salt pork, which released their fat and smoky flavor into the pot. The result was tender, silky cabbage leaves bathed in a savory broth with just the right touch of salt. In many homes, this dish was a weeknight regular, not because it was flashy, but because it was filling, dependable, and used ingredients that were always on hand. Served alongside cornbread or over a small scoop of rice, it could transform the simplest table into a satisfying meal. This stew also carried the comforting smell of something cooking low and slow, the kind of aroma that filled the whole house and made everyone hungry before it was even served. It was the food of patience, where the flavors had time to come together without rush. Supermarkets today offer pre-shredded cabbage and processed pork products, but they cannot recreate the texture and taste of the old, home-cooked version. For those who grew up with it, cabbage and salt pork stew was proof that thrift and flavor could live in the same pot. Stewed okra and tomatoes were the kind of dish that took simple garden produce and turned it into something nourishing enough to feed a family. Okra, a vegetable with African origins, thrived in southern soil, while tomatoes grew easily in backyard gardens. Together, simmered slowly with onions, spices, and sometimes a scrap of salt pork, they created a stew that was tangy, savory, and thick. Families relied on it because it stretched small harvests into larger meals, often served over rice or with cornbread to make it filling. The dish was especially important when meat was too expensive to buy, as it added depth and nutrition without needing animal protein. Stewed okra and tomatoes became more than food. They were a way to survive with what the land provided. For many, the taste carried reminders of summer gardens and the hard work it took to keep families fed. It was frugal, delicious, and a perfect example of survival cooking. Country-style ribs with apple cider glaze turned weekend gatherings into sweet, smoky celebrations in African-American neighborhoods across the 1970s. Meaty pork ribs were marinated in apple cider, brown sugar, and a splash of vinegar, then slow roasted or charcoal grilled until the meat was fall-apart tender. Midway through cooking, the ribs were brushed with a thick cider glaze that caramelized over the heat, creating a sticky surface that clung to every finger. The scent of roasting pork and sweet apples drifted across backyards, drawing neighbors and cousins long before dinner was served. Served with potato salad, baked beans, or simple white bread, the dish balanced tang and richness perfectly. It was both a nod to Southern barbecue traditions and a chance to add a fruity twist that felt fresh for the decade. Country-style ribs with apple cider glaze embodied the joy of family cookouts, where music played late into the evening and every plate carried the flavor of smoke, sweetness, and laughter shared outdoors. Mustard greens with ham hock was a pot of comfort that simmered slowly, filling the kitchen with a savory aroma that promised a satisfying meal. The slightly bitter greens were washed thoroughly, then cooked low and slow with a smoked ham hock, which released its flavor into the broth. As the meat softened, it was shredded into the greens, creating a perfect mix of smoky, salty, and earthy tastes. This dish was often ladled into bowls alongside cornbread, which soaked up the flavorful potlikker at the bottom. It was a year-round favorite, but especially welcome in cooler months when hearty, warming food was needed. The ham hock was not just a flavoring. It represented the tradition of making the most of every cut of meat, ensuring nothing went to waste. Supermarkets today sell pre-washed greens and pre-cooked meats, but they lack the depth of flavor that comes from a slow afternoon simmering on the stove. For many, mustard greens with ham hock were not just food. They were part of the rhythm of home life, where patience in the kitchen always paid off. Cowpea fritters were a dish that came straight out of resilience and memory, with roots reaching back to African cooking traditions. Families would soak and mash dried cowpeas, mix them with a little onion, cornmeal, and seasoning, then fry the mixture in hot lard until crisp on the outside and soft inside. They were cheap, filling, and carried the rich protein that many households could not always get from meat. For Black families in the South, cowpeas were already a staple crop, so using them to create something hearty made perfect sense. These fritters could be eaten plain or dipped in gravy, and they were often made in batches large enough to last a day or two. They carried a deep sense of history, because this kind of cooking showed how old-world techniques adapted to the realities of hard times in America. They were not only nourishment, but also a connection to ancestors who had relied on the same beans for strength. Baked stuffed eggplant with shrimp brought a taste of the Gulf Coast to African-American tables far beyond Louisiana during the 1970s. Large eggplants were halved and hollowed, their flesh sautéed with onions, celery, bell pepper, and Creole spices before being folded into a creamy mixture of shrimp and breadcrumbs. The seasoned stuffing was packed back into the shells and baked until the tops turned golden and fragrant. Each bite offered the sweetness of shrimp, the earthiness of eggplant, and a gentle heat from paprika and cayenne. Families served it with crusty French bread or a simple green salad, elevating an ordinary evening into something memorable. This dish captured the spirit of coastal kitchens where seafood and spice met in perfect harmony, and it traveled inland through family reunions and church suppers. Baked stuffed eggplant with shrimp celebrated both innovation and heritage, showing how a single vegetable could carry the bold flavors of the sea straight to a home kitchen in any corner of America. Skillet candied yams were a feast for both the eyes and the taste buds, glistening in a thick glaze of butter, brown sugar, and spices. Sweet potatoes were peeled and sliced thick, then arranged in a cast-iron skillet where they simmered gently in the sweet, buttery syrup. Cinnamon and nutmeg added warmth, while the natural sugars from the potatoes deepened the caramelization. This was not a quick dish. The yams were left to cook slowly until every slice was tender and every surface was coated with the glossy glaze. The smell alone could draw family members into the kitchen, eager for a taste before the meal was served. On holiday tables, this side dish often sat beside savory meats, providing a sweet contrast that balanced the plate. In everyday meals, it was a treat that made even a humble dinner feel special. Supermarkets today offer canned versions, but they cannot replicate the rich, layered flavor of fresh yams caramelized in a skillet. For those who remember, the first bite of skillet candied yams was pure Southern comfort, the kind that lingered long after the plate was clean. Sorghum syrup bread was a wartime and Depression-era answer to expensive refined sugar. Sorghum, a tall grass grown widely in the South, was boiled down into a thick, dark syrup that tasted earthy and sweet. Families would use it in place of sugar, mixing it into simple bread doughs to stretch rations and still enjoy something satisfying. Sorghum syrup bread was hearty, with a flavor that carried a touch of bitterness, but warmed the spirit. Children often slathered slices with butter or drippings, while adults enjoyed it with strong coffee. It was a farm food at its core, tied directly to the fields where sorghum stalks grew. Sorghum bread meant that no one had to give up sweetness completely even when sugar prices were too high or stores ran out. This loaf was practical, easy to make at home, and deeply tied to Southern soil. After times of scarcity passed, sorghum faded, but the memory of that dark bread stayed. Fried porgy with hot sauce carried the salt air of the Atlantic coast right into neighborhood kitchens and fish fries across the 1970s South and Northeast. Porgy, a small but flavorful ocean fish, was cleaned, scored, and dredged in a seasoned cornmeal mixture before sliding into hot peanut oil. The crackle of frying fish and the sharp scent of cayenne filled the air as golden fillets emerged crisp and steaming. A drizzle of homemade hot sauce or a squeeze of lemon brought just enough heat and brightness to balance the sweet, briny meat. Families served it with sliced white bread, coleslaw, or grits, letting the simple sides highlight the catch of the day. For many households, this was more than a meal. It was a reason for gathering, a chance to laugh and share stories while the fish came out of the pan in batches. Affordable and deeply satisfying, fried porgy celebrated coastal traditions and proved that fresh fish and a steady hand could create a dinner worthy of any weekend crowd. Baked rice pudding with raisins was a dessert that came together from what was already in the kitchen, making it a perfect example of soul food thrift and ingenuity. Leftover rice was never thrown away. Instead, it was mixed with milk, eggs, sugar, and warm spices like cinnamon or nutmeg, then baked slowly until it set into a creamy custard. Raisins added bursts of sweetness, plumping up as they absorbed the milk and spice. This pudding often marked the end of Sunday dinner, or was made on special occasions when the house filled with the scent of vanilla and baked sugar. Served warm or chilled, it carried the taste of comfort and resourcefulness, especially during times when store-bought desserts were too costly. Every cook had their own variation, some adding a touch of lemon zest or a sprinkle of nutmeg on top for extra flavor. It was a dish that could be enjoyed over several days, growing richer as the flavors melded in the refrigerator. While boxed pudding mixes replaced many homemade versions over the years, nothing matches the texture or taste of rice pudding baked slowly in the oven with raisins scattered like little treasures throughout. cornmeal-crusted okra cakes turned a beloved southern vegetable into a crispy entree that delighted both adults and children during the 1970s. Fresh okra pods were sliced thin and mixed with cornmeal, minced onions, and a touch of buttermilk to create a thick batter. Small patties were formed by hand and pan fried in hot oil until each cake developed a crunchy golden crust with a tender green interior. The nutty flavor of the cornmeal complemented the mild tang of the okra, while a sprinkle of salt right out of the pan sealed in the warmth. Served alongside sliced tomatoes or a dollop of hot sauce, these cakes were both hearty and refreshingly light. They made clever use of garden harvests when okra plants produced more pods than anyone could stew. Families prized the recipe as a thrifty way to transform vegetables into a main dish that felt indulgent. Each bite offered a satisfying crunch and a reminder that the simplest garden gifts could create meals worth remembering decades later.
Here is what I want you to do. Pick one meal from this list, just one. Make it this week. Do not order it from a restaurant. Do not buy it frozen. Stand at your stove, put a pot on the burner, and cook it the way your grandmother did. And when it is done, sit at the table, not the couch, the table. Because eating at a table is an act of respect. Respect for the food, for the person who taught you to make it, and for yourself. These 25 meals were never about being cheap. They were about staying alive and staying human in a world that made both of those things difficult for Black seniors living alone. Drop your answer in the comments. Tell me which one you're going to make. I want to know if the Potlikker gets more love than the pinto beans, because these are not just recipes. They are proof that the simplest food made in one pot, eaten alone at a kitchen table, can still be an act of dignity.